Our first plenary talk will be by Ada Dedebas Dundar from the University of Nevada, Reno, and her talk will be about witnessing the distant others in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
So thank you. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for making this possible. It's a great honor to be here today. So my talk today is going to be is that working fine? Okay. On my forthcoming book project, second book project, which mostly focuses on humanitarian witnessing and theater. Sort of this, what I call as the ambivalent spatial relation that's inherent in both, but mostly in contemporary Anglophone plays. But today's talk is somewhat derived from it, but I'm going to focus on a specific adaptation and production of a Motivisniks play by a Turkish actor and director. On September 2nd, 2015, the photo of Aylan Kurdi, a 3-year-old Syrian boy lying on the Aegean coast, was widely distributed in new media and drew international attention. When his photo overpowered Western media, I was in the US working on my book titled Witnessing Stories of Distance and thinking about the process of bearing witness to atrocities. As a Turkish national educated in the US, I spent numerous beach vacations on the town which Aylan's corpse lay, and suddenly found myself in this problematic stance between the urge to know more about this boy who died in my home country, and yet the secret relief to have witnessed his dead body through a third medium, rather than seeing it on the beach during one of my vacations. After the dissemination of Kurdi's photo, feelings of guilt and complicity surfaced, and international aid organizations started humanitarian campaigns for Syrian refugees. Kurdi's photo became an icon for Syrian refugee crisis and precipitated an unforeseen social media activism in which many users shared and overshared this image of vulnerability. However, only 6 days after Aylan's death, on September 8, 2015. Oh, okay, sorry. So is it, oh yes, no, it's, okay, sorry about that. However, only 6 days after Aylan's death, on September 8, 2015, a Hungarian camera woman tripped a Syrian refugee as he was trying to cross the border, and thus this heightened compassion for Aylan in new media failed to stretch to real life. Although the image of Aylan struck us with a profound sense of empathy and guilt, it still did not move us to acknowledge the possibility of becoming neighbors with the very same refugees. Even though witnessing the quandary of victims and sharing their images of vulnerability have recently become the new trends in humanitarianism, the moment the distant other enters the self-territory, he is deemed to be injurious. In the 21st century, witnessing the suffering of distant others and visiting sites of memory proliferate. Every year, millions of tourists visit Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum in Japan, the killing fields in Cambodia, Auschwitz, the 9/11 Memorial, and other similar sites of suffering, and then they return home maintaining a detached sphere to distant others. The image of human suffering has always been in demand, yet it has recently taken a novel shape when it's being lensed through a remote medium, that is, social media or storytelling, as it is a simulated reality that keeps its indifference to the subject. This infatuation with witnessing distant others emerges in multiple forms. Number one, an inclination to view violence on media and popular culture, or engagement in dark tourism, sharing photos of vulnerability on social media, or an increasing interest in reading and watching stories of survival. This problematic stance, this intrigue to approach suffering through a remote medium, locates human rights consumers in an ambivalent spatial relation to distant others. On the one hand, the unfolding of stories and images of suffering responds to the recent surge in this enthusiasm and the need to empathize with them. On the other hand, this empathetic connection between human rights consumers and distant others is a fabricated one, as it's delivered through a third party and sustains a spatial aloofness between the victim and the witness. Likewise, theater employs this very same ambivalent spatial relation that witnessing human rights atrocities has in common. The self-referentiality and simulated reality that are inherent in dramatic literature focus on this very same tendency to remain at a safe distance and yet to be close to the site of suffering at the same time. In my book, I utilize the immediacy of theater and discuss this concept of ambivalent spatial relation that human rights abuses in theater have in three aspects. One, how gender-based violence is performed and simulated on stage. Two, the ways in which humanitarian travel functions in the spatial ambiguity. Three, the self's engagement with the other's testimony of survival. Thanks to these spatial distinctions between distance and proximity, self and other, real and fiction, I argue contemporary Anglophone plays on witnessing and humanitarianism displace Western viewers in an ambiguity in which they resist the despecializing of the theatrical space in order to create an empathetic bond with the distant other. Building on my book, in this presentation, I'm going to focus on this ambivalence in self's spatial relation to distant others, or AKA our new neighbors, in regards to Turkish theater ensemble Dostlar Theater's staging and adapting of Matei Wisniewski's Migrants in Istanbul. As the plights of Syrian refugees in Istanbul are being performed, the secular and urban elite audience are compelled to reconceptualize their biased views of the refugees and to re-spatialize Istanbul as a city where they acknowledge their coexistence with their neighbors. In Weiland's Six Ways Reflections, Slavoj Žižek highlights the safety zone that one maintains to their neighbor, reveals the social constructed nature of this relationship, and explicates one's capacity to bear the other as long as he does not step into the self's territory. He writes, quote, "The tortured subject is no longer a neighbor, but an object whose pain is neutralized, reduced to a property that has to be dealt with in a rational utilitarian calculus," unquote. Through the objectification of the other, the self, according to Žižek, is protected from getting into a close contact with the other. However, he further states, quote, "Today's liberal tolerance towards others, the respect of otherness and openness towards it, is counterpointed by an obsessive fear of harassment. In short, the other is just fine, but only insofar as his presence is not intrusive, insofar as this other is not really other. My duty to be tolerant towards the other effectively means that I should not get too close to him, intrude on his space. In other words, I should respect his intolerance of my over-proximity," unquote. Žižek's emphasis on proximity clearly reshuffles this spatial relation and can be read in the light of theatrical productions that dismantle this breadth between the self and the other. On another level, the safety buffer that one wishes to keep towards the other also empowers the individual with a more humane response and prevents compassion, what is known as compassion fatigue. In plethora of suffering masses, wars, genocides, the public's short attention span and boredom with international news, and the media's preoccupation with what is called as a crisis coverage, the remoteness of suffering may inhibit a possible reluctance to witness stories of victimization. Thanks to the display of victimization through a third medium and its diluted intensity, acting in theater function as distinguished tools to initiate a conversation, a reconfiguring of prejudices, and perhaps paving the way for the emergence of a genuine attentiveness to distant others. In Distant Suffering, Morality, Media, and Politics, Luc Boltanski underscores the newly changing role of theater in this act of bearing witness to atrocities from afar, making a clear-cut distinction between the roles of the actor and the spectator in early modern drama versus contemporary drama. He argues, quote, "From anywhere, the new spectator observes the actors and their spectators, both of whom are involved in a common scene, since the actors know themselves to be observed by the spectators, and the spectators know that they know this. He's not absorbed by what takes place on the stage in that state of participation or identification, so often described in the innumerable commentaries arising from the ambiguous notion of catharsis. Nor does he identify or thrill with the other spectators, but instead keeps control of his emotions," unquote. It is this newly adopted role of the spectator and his anti-cathartic stance to the site of suffering that makes theater align with witnessing and self's proximity to suffering. Dramatic action, along with metatheatrical devices, help audience to be liberated from the boundaries of a cathartic experience and locate them in the midst of this ambiguity of witnessing. The close affinity between witnessing atrocities in theater and the urge to know more about human rights abuses, dark tourism sites, and the suffering of distant others is further explored in contemporary Anglophone plays. To name a few examples, Catherine Fillow's Silence of God, Gillian Plowman's Yours Abundantly from Zimbabwe, Christine Evans's Trojan Barbie, and Sonia Linden's I Have Before Me a Remarkable Document given to me by a young lady from Rwanda, all utilize metatheatrical tools to pinpoint this ambivalent spatial distance and the spectator's role in reconceptualizing the theatrical space from a site of suffering to a space to trigger compassionate and ethical responses. Turkish playwright, actor, and director Genco Erkal's Dostlar Theater, a theater ensemble that was founded in 1969 in Istanbul, is renowned for its leftist and political productions. Recently, in line with the changing socio-political dynamics in Turkey, he has become the emblem of anti-Erdoganism, and his audience have turned into the newly marginalized secular elites who oppose his dictatorial regime. In February, he adapted and staged French-Romanian playwright Matei Wisniewski's Migrants, portraying the predicament of Syrian refugees in Istanbul. Organized in small vignettes, the play depicts their lives in the fringes of the city, along with their interactions with smugglers and city dwellers, and delineates a darker side of Syrian refugee problem that the majority of his audience has been unaware of. Some of these anecdotes include, for instance, an elderly woman seeking her grandson's cemetery in the Aegean coast, 2 refugees fleeing from their mercenary smuggler, 2 prostitutes making their ends meet at a brothel in Istanbul, a young man who is being convinced by organ traffickers to pay off his debts through organ donation. With real-life images and video footages of refugees, spectators are fashioned to witness how Syrians in Istanbul, whom they have so far ignored and called with derogatory terms, actually live side by side in their city. Dostlar Theater's production has 2 remarkable roles in challenging the spectators witnessing the distant other. First and foremost, by delineating the struggles of refugees in Istanbul and combining them with docudrama tools, it disputes the common prejudices against the Syrians in Istanbul. His real-life depictions of the Syrian refugees in Istanbul challenge his audience, who is inclined to categorize the refugees as followers and potential advocates of Erdogan and denote them as being lazy, dark, mercenary, rapists, and traitors. These are the common derogatory terms that are being attached to the Syrian refugees in Turkey in general. Erkal's outstanding staging combined with metatheatrical tools debunks the paradigm of a well-to-do Syrian refugee who feeds off the resources of Turkey. Last but not least, by adapting the play to contemporary Istanbul, thus underscoring that Syrian refugees are actually neighbors to the audience, Erkal accentuates the city as a site of a shared space that could embrace empathy and multiculturalism. Recognizing their proximity to their neighbors, the audience inevitably respatializes Istanbul and the actual theatrical space as heterogeneous entities that highlight both parties' proximity to one another and initiate a reconstruction of the distant other as the new neighbor. In Emma Willis's words, theatrical space precipitates this awareness of one's curiosity with the distant other and his suffering. She states, quote, "An ethics of spectatorship to such sites might be said to begin with the acknowledgement that despite an arrival that's never completed and the lack of presence, we are nonetheless located within a shared ethical space. That is, by our own emplacement, our appearance, we acknowledge our responsibility towards the disappeared, those who have exited," unquote. Through a similar shared space that Dostlar Theater provides for its audience, this ambivalent spatial relation between the elite Istanbulites who begin to acknowledge their neighbors and the actors playing the role of Syrian refugees is further highlighted as real-life images intervene and dominate the theatrical sphere. In Ironic Spectators, Solidarity in the Age of Post-Humanitarianism, Lily Chuliaraki underscores the ironic predicament of bearing witness to vulnerable others and explicates strong connections among the spectral aspects of witnessing others in theater. By analyzing various types of social media, she argues that, quote, the planetary connectivity of the new media have now turned the world into a new Teatrum Mundi, a theater whose moralizing force lies in the fact that we do not only passively watch distant others, but we can also their own reality as actors, unquote. In a similar way, Dostlar Theater's 2018 production and adaptation of Migrants creates a Teatrum Mundi in which the citizens of Istanbul acknowledge their neighbors and are impelled to extend their sympathies beyond that of a remote medium. Their sharing the same ethical space in theater serves as a replica of their coexistence in the same city, and thus the spectators have no longer witnessed the distant other, but rather learned to live side by side with their new fellow residents, ushering in the materialization of a dialogue between both parties. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I ask Chetana Nagavajara from Silpakorn University to come and give his talk about the others as our better case studies from Thailand.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. By a strange coincidence, I was having dinner with the keynote speaker last night. And what I'm going to present to you now will be just a supplement to what you've already heard as our keynote speech this morning. I'm talking about my own experience as a Southeast Asian. And I think that probably the concrete examples that I'm going to give will somehow substantiate the points made in the keynote speech. First of all, let me deal with a few basic principles that govern our action and thinking. First, our door is always opened, but the house is ours. And this attitude probably has helped us to sustain our independence in the midst of colonialism in Southeast Asia. And we were one of the few nations that survived the threat of colonialism, because our door is always open. Please do come in, but the house is ours. Another boon is that what we have inherited from one of the greatest Asian civilizations, namely the Indian civilization, is Buddhism. I'm not saying that other religions do not have any importance in our lives, but the majority of the Thai are Buddhist. And there is this basic concept of Buddhism, namely the basic of Satta Loka, which means beings of this world. Human beings as well as animals, as well as other living beings, belong to the same category of beings of this world. It sounds almost like Heidegger, but it is not Heidegger. It's more than Heidegger. And being a Germanist myself, I always tend to think of the German term Mitmenschen. Are there German colleagues in the audience? Yeah. I hope I interpreted correctly. Mit means together or with. Menschen means man. We are human beings together. We belong to the same category. We belong to this world, and we have equal rights. And that is the most important point. Let's look at our contemporary problem. And the heading of this section is not from a vantage point. If wisdom comes from looking back and reflecting deeply on the past while remaining awake to the present, our 21st century has learned very little or nothing from history. The first picture is that of Rohingyas fleeing from Burma into Bangladesh. And they're just beginning to sit down and talk about repatriation. The second picture is even more dismal. This happened in 2015. The dead body of a Syrian boy, his name is Alan Kurdi, was washed ashore on a Turkish beach. This did shock the world, but did it move the world into positive action? Yes and no. So what I'm addressing now is refugee problems and the image of man. And why not seek help? And why not seek help from other continents? I'm thinking in particular of the Nigerian poet Ashebe, who wrote this poem, which I found most touching when I read it many years back. He was talking about refugee problems in Africa in 1970. And if you consider well, how far have we moved, or how little have we moved from that problem, or have we not moved at all? No Madonna and child could touch that picture of a woman's tenderness for a son she soon would have to forget. And he goes on and on. But you see, the arts are perhaps in the position to restore and to maintain the dignity of man, whereas in the real world, human beings are suffering destitution as well as humiliation, as well as atrocity, which are man-made, mainly man-made. So this example from Africa leads me to another poem by a colleague of mine, a Thai poet. He was talking about Rohingyas, refugees in 2014. And look at the last two lines. Could it be that Allah has lost sight of you? Woe to you whom Allah does not see. He's not taking issue with human beings anymore, but he's taking issue with the Lord in whatever religion. Being a Germanist and a comparatist and a student of European literatures, I can't help thinking of Voltaire. Going back to his poem on the disaster of Lisbon in 1756, and there he took issue with the Lord because he said that so many innocent peoples perished in that disaster, including innocent children. How can I tolerate the conditions of this world? If there is a benevolent God up there, I'm casting doubt on his power to rule over humanity and to rule over this world. But he stopped short of becoming an atheist, whereas his friend, well, not really his friend, sometimes his enemy, Diderot went a little further by becoming atheist. I'm not propagating that we should all disregard the existence of religions that respect God. But that leads to where? And here, as a Germanist, I would have to cite this new notion of welcoming culture. In German, it's called Willkommenskultur, which perhaps has saved Europe from being humiliated in the midst of all these problems that are confronting the world, of refugee problems and all that. Let me get back to Buddhism. I'm trying to interpret the German notion of welcoming culture by way of Buddhism. Actually, there's a philosophical root in the German policy of Willkommenskultur. It is meant as an atonement for the guilt committed by their fathers and their forefathers during the Second World War. And Mrs. Merkel's policy, which has put her in a very, very difficult position now because she's lost so many votes. But what she said about Syrian refugees when this problem erupted a few years ago, still ringing in my ears. She said that if the same crisis happens again, I shall do the same thing. This is very courageous. It's not political, it's humanistic. So Buddhism will not interpret it that way. Buddhism demands that individuals do good for its own sake. For it is beyond human comprehension to link good deeds of the past with what was committed, to link good deeds of the present with what was committed in this life or in previous lives in specific ways. But I don't have to use Buddhism to interpret this German policy, because they have their own Kantian philosophy of categorical imperative. You do good in whatever circumstances. So let me turn to my own culture of being an open door policy, which has become a way of life. The example I'm going to quote is rather mundane. People all over the world were very appreciative of Chinese ceramics. And that's why the word China doesn't mean China. China means ceramic wares, which is very much loved. And if you go to visit castles in Europe, they will have a special room full of ceramics, or even made of earthenware. The Chinese excelled in this art, and the Thai were ready to learn from them, and then to perfect the art in such a way as to come up with their own product, which is known as Sangalok. It was very popular in the 13th century when it was first exported to all Asian countries. The Japanese used this earthenware for their tea ceremony, and other peoples in Southeast Asia use it for other purposes. And if you want to see the most perfect collection, don't go to Thailand, because all that we have are broken pieces of this Sangalok. But you have to go to the National Museum of Indonesia. There they have a complete collection of Sangalok. Let's get back to the 17th century. This is the capital city of Ayutthaya reconstructed. 17th century Ayutthaya, reconstructed by way of using written sources from various places. It was a sprawling, prosperous trading center of Asia. Multiculturalism was rampant. And we have a record in the form of a book written by the French ambassador sent to the court of Ayutthaya by none other than Louis XIV. Monseigneur Simon de la Lubert wrote this book, Du Royaume de Siam, on the kingdom of Siam, which was very popular. The ambassador was very meticulous in recording what he saw and what he experienced, and he made shrewd observations on many things. And even Thai rely on this source when we write our history, because many of our written records perished in the fall of Ayutthaya in 1767. But one piece of information would make you startle. According to Monsieur de la Lubert, 40 different languages were being spoken in Ayutthaya. 40 different languages. So this is more than welcoming culture. It's more than an open door policy. It's a way of life tempered by religious tolerance. So by mid-19th century, this cosmopolitanism has persisted over centuries, and King Rama III of the present dynasty commissioned his court poets and court painters to create verses describing people speaking 32 languages with corresponding paintings. And this is how the French look to the Thai. And the verse that describes the French has to do with the French as a military power, because they came to Ayutthaya and to Siam to help build fortifications, and our fortifications looked as though these were designed by Vauban, you know. But why 32? It could have been more, but because there were only 32 windows in a religious edifice on which these paintings were made. Let's look back to France itself. In the 17th century, how a French writer, a very famous French writer, reacted to the way that we, not only the Thai, but also people of Asia and Southeast Asia, welcomed Europeans before they soon realized that the ambitions of the Europeans were others than just trading. This is what La Bruyère said. Yet they tolerate our friars and priests and sometimes listen to them, allow them to build churches and perform all their missionary duties. Well, one of the churches still stands there. The piece of land was given by King Narai in the 17th century, and he told the missionaries who came to him and presented themselves to him, well, do convert as many as you like. I don't mind. Because he fully realized that the missionaries would not convert so many. We did not have to be converted because religious tolerance had taught us to be friendly to other beliefs and to other religions as well. So a Buddhist can go into any ceremony. I go to churches in Europe when I go there because I love Johann Sebastian Bach, you know. I haven't been to a religious service in Leipzig, but I've been to other places that I do enjoy the ceremonies. But even the teachings can be cult in such a way as to establish certain similarities in terms of religious beliefs. So he did not convert many. The missionaries were not very successful, but they were successful. They have been successful in other domains, especially in education. Missionary schools still rank among the best. Let me mention another people, the Mon. You don't know much about the Mon because you cannot, when you talk about a people, you talk about a culture, you always associate it with territorial identity. The Mons have high culture without specific territorial identity. That is a point that the humanities should be debating, should have been debating and should continue to debate. What have we learned from the Mon? Well, the Mon have a very old civilization. dating from the 11th century, there was a Mon kingdom called Davaravati. And all historians do recognize and do agree that their civilization was very, very sophisticated. Sophisticated in what terms? In intellectual, in artistic, and in religious domain. The Thai have learned from the Mon two things about Buddhism, namely scholarship is important, and also monastic order. So let me conclude now by talking about the Chinese. I would need probably half an hour to talk about the Chinese in Thailand, but they are supposed to be, can I have 3 minutes? 2 minutes? Okay, 2 minutes? Okay. Patriotism and the adoptive land. The Chinese are supposed to be very well integrated into Thai society. So much so that a hero emerged from the fall of Ayutthaya in 1767. He was son of a Chinaman who grew up in Thailand and entered the bureaucracy and became a general. And he later established himself as a king, known as King Taksin, son of a Chinaman to a Thai mother. And it was he who restored independence after the fall of Ayutthaya. And we call him Taksin the Great, knowing full well that he's a Sino-Thai. Why not? Why not make a Sino-Thai a great hero of Thailand if he saved us from the yoke of colonialism, this time an Asian colonialism? And when there was a big demonstration about 5 years ago, another son of a Chinaman came out to lead the demonstrators that finally toppled a corrupt government. And this is what he said: "I am son of a Chinaman who has come to save Thailand." Most touching, most touching. Next episode and final episode. This has made headline news in all the press all over the world. 12 young football players and their 25-year-old coach were trapped in a cave for 19 days. How did they survive? The coach taught them, had been teaching them how to do Buddhist meditation. They could survive for 19 days without getting mad. That is very important. And then in the end, they were saved by a team of rescuers. When we asked for help, help came within 24 hours. And those people who came were experts in cave diving from various nations. So the open door policy has paid off. Let me conclude by posing a question. In the light of what we have heard this morning, in the light of what we have heard in the keynote speech, and in the light of what you've heard about what I believe in, I think the humanities may have to redirect itself somehow. It can no longer remain a cloistered elitism of Oxbridge with their dreamy spires. That is not sufficient anymore. The challenges to the humanities are more mundane. We have to get down to the everyday level. We have to engage in the practicalities of life. We have to become a streetwise discipline. If you give me 1 more hour, I shall elaborate to you what I mean by streetwise discipline. But I don't mean that we have to take to the streets when we oppose something. I think the tradition of accumulating a body of knowledge, reflecting deeply on it, becoming very critical of whatever we encounter in this life, that is the privilege of the humanities which should be preserved. But we should get down more to mundane things and become a streetwise discipline. Thank you for your kind attention.
next speaker, please, Albert Braz from the University of Alberta.
Please give me a 2-minute warning and I'll finish up.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yes. Thank you. Just press the and go. Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Okay. Every country is supposed to have a national myth and presumably a national image or face. For the renowned 18th century German philosopher, theologian, and literary critic Johann Gottfried Herder, the reason the nation is the most natural collective unit is that it's really an extended family. Herder, of course, envisages the family as not only sharing the same language, but also being ethnically homogeneous. But what happens to a family or a nation when its members vary phenotypically? Does it still possess a quintessential face, or does its heterogeneity demand that we reconsider the widespread belief that a nation necessarily has a distinct human image? Because of the mass migration of peoples around the globe, at least since the mid-20th century, to say nothing of internal variation, most countries today cannot even pretend that they're ethnically uniform. Yet the myth of the national physiognomy persists, both outside and within countries. People continue to believe that they know what a Brazilian, an Indian, or a Swede looks like. But if one looks closely at those populations, it wouldn't be nearly so self-evident. As I will argue in my paper, focusing particularly on Canada, one of the great challenges of our time is not only to accept that humanity is diverse, but that so are many nation-states, indeed families. Canada, as you know, sits at the northern end of the Americas. Because the Arctic makes up so much of its landmass, and it experiences a prolonged winter, it's often described as the Great White North. Whiteness, however, doesn't refer merely to the snowy landscape, but also to the populace. In the late 1990s, the future Canadian parliamentary poet laureate, George Eliot Clark, published an essay titled White Like Canada, in which he maintains that his homeland's dominant ethnocultural groups have never had a vision of Canada as anything but a white man's country. Clark, who is of African descent, elsewhere contends that Canadians like to see themselves as a nation of good Nordic, pure, mainly white folks, as opposed to the lawless, hot-tempered, impure mongrel Americans. The whiteness of Canada is clearly reflected in the faces of its most influential writers. Toward the end of the 20th century, the list of the greatest Canadian authors in English usually includes such figures as Margaret Atwood, Robertson Davies, Margaret Lawrence, and the 2013 recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature, Alice Munro. Needless to say, such uniformly Caucasian faces aren't truly representative of Canadian demographics or of Canadian literature for that matter. Like other American countries, Canada has a significant Indigenous population, and contemporary writers like Thomson Highway, Eden Robinson, and Katharina Vermat have made a concerted effort to remind other Canadians and the world of their presence as well as their continuing cultural and political vitality. The Canadianness of Canada's Indigenous peoples obviously cannot be contested, even if they haven't always been considered full Canadian citizens or citizens at all. Whatever else they may be, they're molded by the geography and history of what is now Canada. The right to belong in Canada, though, has not always been extended to so-called visible minorities who historically have had to struggle to ensure their place in the country. As the Afro-Quebec playwright Lorena Gale captures this reality in her poetic memoir, Je me souviens, or I remember, which is Quebec's official motto, when people ask me which island I come from, I say Montreal. and they look confused. When people tell me to go back where I came from, I look confused. A similar view is articulated by the West Coast poet and novelist Jai Kagawa. While describing the experiences of the protagonist of her novel Obazan, she writes that the one surefire question that the school teacher Naomi Nakani can expect when she meets people, including her own students, is where she comes from, since everyone presumes that she's a foreigner. Kagawa's 1981 novel is arguably the most cogent exploration of the whiteness of Canadian citizenship and, by extension, of Canada's national face. Centered on the ignoble treatment of Canadians of Japanese origin during the Second World War, when they're forcibly removed from a broad strip along the Pacific coast, Obazan documents the desperation of people born in Canada to prove themselves Canadian. It could be argued that the animus towards Japanese Canadians by various levels of Canadian government and Canadians in general was a consequence of the fact that Canada was at war with Japan. Thus, as Naomi's brother Stephen remarks, Japanese Canadians became caught in a riddle. We are both the enemy and not the enemy. Yet at the time, Canada was also at war with Germany, and Naomi cannot help but notice that the ever more numerous demonstrators are much more vehement about Canadian-born Japanese than they are about German-born Germans, which leads her to conclude that this is due to the fact that we look different. What it boils down to is an undemocratic racial antagonism. In short, most Canadians have more affinities with Germans and other white foreigners than they do with white people of Japanese descent, even if they're born and raised in the country. In fairness, Canada's self-image has changed remarkably since the 1940s. The most notable of these developments is the Canadian Multiculturalism Act of 1988, the Canadian government's official policy to recognize and promote the understanding that multiculturalism reflects the cultural and racial diversity of Canadian society and to acknowledge the freedom of all members of Canadian society to preserve, enhance, and share their cultural heritage. No less a figure than the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, told the General Assembly of the United Nations in 2017 that although Canada remains a work in progress, it now accepts that it is a country built on different cultures, different religions, different languages, all coming together. As he underlined, diversity has become our strength. The transformation of the idea of Canada is certainly evident in the emergence of writers like Thompson Highway, Lorraine Nagel, Jai Kagawa, and Priscilla Apple, whom I'll discuss shortly. Yet there are indications that the perception that the Canadian face is Caucasian hasn't quite vanished. The relationship between a literature and the nation in which it is produced is necessarily conflicted, since literature both legitimizes the nation and exposes its shortcomings. So perhaps it shouldn't come as a surprise that Canadian literature often reveals that Canada's multicultural vision hasn't been embraced by a sizable portion of the citizenry, including writers. For instance, in a 2018 essay, the fiction writer and poet Pasha Mala details how the country's most important prize for literary humor, the Leacock Medal, has never been awarded to a person of color since its inception in 1947. Mala's explanation for this statistical aberration is that the ostensibly national award has succeeded less at celebrating the breadth of our nation's comedic writing than in substantiating a set of culturally exclusive tropes by lionizing books mostly written by a subsect of our population to mollify people just like them. Again, contrary to what Kagawa's Naomi Nakani maintains, not everything a Canadian does is Canadian, for some Canadians are deemed to be more representative of the national way of life than others. The persistence of whiteness, of the whiteness of the Canadian face, is particularly manifest in literary texts such as Jane Urquhart's Sanctuary Line. Published in 2010, Urquhart's novel is set on the multi-generational Butler apple orchard on the north shore of Lake Erie across from Ohio. Of Irish extraction, the Butlers have branches on both sides of the international line. In fact, the current owner, Stan Butler, is married to a US cousin named Sadie. Stan is a dynamic and innovative orchardist, and the farm has become very successful. At the same time, it is heavily dependent on temporary Mexican farm workers under the supervision of his foreman, Dolores. Actually, the main crisis in the novel, which will culminate in the collapse of the Butler orchard, occurs when Sadie returns unexpectedly from a visit to her family in Ohio in the middle of the night and catches Stan and Dolores in bed. Most germane in terms of the subject, we then learn that Dolores' teenage son, Theo, who's described throughout the narrative as the Mexican boy, is Stan's child. Tellingly, even after the members of the family acknowledge that Theo shares their genetic inheritance, that is, that he's a Butler, no one ever refers to him as Canadian. His brown eyes and brown hands appear to preclude the possibility of his truly belonging to the land of the maple leaf. Consequently, when Theo gets killed in a car accident in the aftermath of Sadie's discovery of Stan's affair with Dolores, his body is promptly returned to Mexico. Theo thus forever leaves his father's homeland, the country where he had never been able to envisage a future for himself except as a laborer. Apple's depiction of the Canadian face in her memoir, Projection: Encounters with My Runaway Mother, is remarkably different from Urquhart's, but no less revealing. A prolific poet, fiction writer, and playwright, Apple was the offspring of an Indian-born Canadian civil servant and the daughter of a Brazilian military attaché to the Brazilian embassy in Ottawa. When Apple was 2 years old and her brother was 3, their father swallowed contaminated water during a sailboat accident in Antigua and was rendered quadriplegic. Their mother was unable to adjust to her new situation and 6 years later abandoned her husband and children and fled to her native Brazil, draining all the money from the family's bank accounts. In Projection, Apple relates her trip to South America to meet the truant parents she hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. Mother and daughter never really reconnect, in part because they come to see each other not as individuals, but as representatives of their birthplaces, with each other repeatedly trying to demonstrate that her polity is superior to the others. Early on, Apple's mother warns about the dangers of being mugged in São Paulo, since Brazilians will think she hails from the United States. Everyone will assume you're an American, explains her mother. No one knows what a Canadian looks like. They'll take the chance they're robbing an American. Presumably, Apple knows what her compatriots look like. She's very much a post-multiculturalism act Canadian, someone who, like her immigrant father, loves the policy's architect, former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau. She's such a patriot that she discloses that even in her teens, the one day she didn't like to work was Canada Day, July 1st, and that in truth, she felt more Canadian than part of a family. Interestingly, this is not how she's perceived after she lands in Brazil. On the contrary, she remarks that no one here thinks I'm anything but Brazilian when they set their eyes upon me. With my exotic mixed heritage, my abundant curly black hair and olive complexion and high Indian cheekbones, I'm not used to this and find it liberating to blend in. The inescapable implication is that this doesn't occur in Canada, that her face is not usually taken for that of her homeland. Apple's unexpected disclosure that she looks Brazilian, not Canadian, underscores how common still is the idea that Canada's national face is white, a view that incidentally is shared by people of all sorts of ethno-racial backgrounds. It's worth noting that Canadian blacks like Lorena Gale are reproached for identifying themselves as Canadian, not just by white Canadians, but also by other blacks, who see their claim to Canadianness as proof that they don't know where they come from or who they are. As a West Indian woman admonishes Gale, she's assimilated, being black on the outside, white on the inside. In the end, while the notion of national physiognomies has long been dismissed as pseudoscience or race science, the persistence of the belief that countries have homogeneous faces suggests that it remains a potent cultural and psychological force in the 21st century. Margaret Lawrence, for one, insists that a country like Canada is a family, but a very, very varied family. Yet, judging by Canadian literature, this diversity is far from being universally embraced, even or especially by Canadians. Of course, what Canadian literature also demonstrates is the constructedness of ethnocultural identity, since categories like whiteness turn out to be extremely fluid. This is illustrated by Lawrence herself. Lawrence is often perceived as the embodiment of Canada, the most Canadian of all Canadian writers, and Canada supposedly has a white face. Yet in her account of a 1980 bus trip that she takes from a small Ontario town to Toronto, Lawrence shows that her whiteness was not at all transparent, despite her Scots-Irish ancestry. Since the bus was crowded, she had to share a seat with an older woman named Bertha, who was sloshed. Bertha became irritated with the fact that Lawrence was reading a book, an activity she interpreted as a sign that her traveling companion was a foreigner. As Bertha accosted Lawrence, "I know what you are. You're one of those damn wood people from Vietnam or Taiwan. That's what you are, wood people. One of them. Why did we let you all in? What language do you speak? Pardon my curiosity. Chinese? Vietnamese?" When Lawrence replied that she was Canadian, Bertha immediately retorted, "I should have known. You're a half-breed. One of those goddamn half-breeds. Admit it, you are." To be fair, given her state of inebriation, Bertha was probably not the best judge of either human character or physiognomy. Nevertheless, the fact she doesn't think Lawrence fits the national image suggests that the Canadian family is much more varied than the paradigm allows. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will ask Yong Wan from Chinese University of Hong Kong to take the stage and talk about the first personal authority on knowing others better than they do themselves. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. Very honored to give this talk here this morning. The topic is the first person authority. The subtitle is slightly different from what I gave. Imperative to know the other mind. I would like to start my talk today by telling you two stories from one of the two most important Taoist texts, Zhuangzi. The first story is about Hunden. The emperor of the southern sea was Su. The emperor of the northern sea was Hu. And the emperor of the central region was Hunden. Su and Hu often met each other in Hunden's lands, where Hunden provided wonderful hospitality. Thinking of repaying his kindness, Su and Hu said, "Everyone has 7 apertures with which to see, hear, eat, and breathe. Only Hunden does not have them. Let's try to open them on him." They opened 1 aperture a day. By the 7th day, Hunden died. I would like to call your attention to the fact that the emperor of the northern sea and the emperor of the southern sea didn't intend to kill Hunden. Actually, they are trying to, as you can see, repay his kindness, because Hunden provides wonderful hospitalities when they meet in his land. So this is one story. And I want to tell you the second story from the same text with a similar idea. of old, when a seabird alighted outside the capital of Lu, the Marquis of Lu went out to receive it, gave it wine in the temple, and had the jiuzhou music played to amuse it, and a bullock slaughtered to feed it. However, the bird was dazed and too timid to eat or drink anything. In 3 days, it was dead. Now, similarly, Marquis of Lu didn't intend to kill the seabird. Actually, he loves it, right? But the result is that the seabird was dead. Now, unlike the first story, the second story actually, just like other good story, ends up with a moral. And that was the moral told at the end of the story. The text says, this was treating the bird as he, the Marquis of Lu, would like to be treated, and not as the bird would like to be treated. Had he treated it as the bird would like to be treated, he would have put it to roost in a deep forest and allowed it to wander over the plain, swim in a river or lake, feed upon fish, and fly in the formation with others. Now, I have been thinking that these stories, along with other stories in the text, actually embodies a very important ethical ideas. And this ethical idea, I have previously characterized it in different ways. On one occasion, I characterized it as providing a moral cup rule. This cup rule is in contrast to what we are familiar with, moral golden rule and moral silver rule. According to the golden rule, do unto others as you would like to be done unto. The silver rule, do not do unto others as you would not like to be done unto. Now, both golden rule and the silver rule assume something, that you, the agent, and the other person, patient, are similar. So what you would like will be also something the patient like. And what you don't like would be also something the patient, the recipient of your action, don't like. But that's not true, because human beings are different, as mentioned or implied by the two stories I just told. So in contrast, I propose what I call moral cup rule. What it means is this: do unto others as they would like it to be done unto. Or, negatively, do not do unto others as they would not like it to be done unto. On another occasion, I regarded the ethical idea contained in these two stories as ethics of difference, which is in contrast to ethics of commonality. According to ethics of commonality, all human beings are similar, if not the same, in all morally relevant aspects. Thus, what is the right thing to do to one person must be the right thing to do to another. In contrast, in the ethical difference that I identify in the Zhuangzi, there are important morally relevant differences among people in terms of their ideas and ideals, interests and preferences, habits and customs, and cultures and religions. Thus, the same action that is considered moral toward one person may be immoral when directed to a different one. On a third occasion, I kept the same idea as patient moral relativism, which is in contrast to other two types of moral relativism that we are familiar with in the Western philosophical tradition, One is called appraiser moral relativism, according to which moral judgments are relative to the standards of the appraisers or appraiser groups. Whoever is making the moral judgment, then the moral standard is relative to the person who makes the moral judgment. According to another type of familiar type of moral relativism, which is agent moral relativism, moral judgments are relative to the standards of the agent or the agent group. Now, I have argued that both of these two types of moral relativisms are problematic. And of course, I cannot go into detail here. But what I'm trying to show you is that there is a different type of moral relativism that I think is not problematic, which we can find in the text of Zhuangzi, implied in the two stories I just told, which I call, actually there is no such kind of term, but I call it patient moral relativism. Moral judgments are relative to the patient's standards. Now, whatever you call it, whether you call it moral corporate rule, or call it ethics of difference, or call it patient moral relativism, what this kind of ethical idea assumes is that when we are acting upon others, we needed to know, needed to understand others. This is very different from moral golden rule. Moral golden rule tells us, do unto others as you would like to be done unto. So when I act upon others, I just try to see. I close my eyes, I see what I would like to be done unto, and then I do the same thing to other people. But according to the moral idea that I have been highlighting, then whenever I act upon others, I need to understand the uniqueness, the difference this agent may, the patient may have from my ideas or ideals, preference, interests, cultures, religions, customs. So this raises a number of questions, and I cannot discuss all these questions. I think I can only talk about two questions if I have the time. The first question is, what does it mean to say that we have understood others? The second question is, can we really understand others? So about the first question, this comes to the main title of my talk today about the first-person authority. The term comes from the title of an essay, actually exactly same title, the first-person authority, written by one of the most influential contemporary analytic philosopher, Donald Davidson. And he, according to him, when a speaker asserts that he has a belief, hope, desire, or intention, there is a presumption that he is not mistaken, a presumption that does not attach to his ascription of similar mental states to others. So why should there be this asymmetry between attribution of attitudes to our present selves and attributions of the same attitudes to other selves? In other words, if I say, I believe something at this moment, nobody will ask, do you really believe that? Or perhaps you are not believing that, because I know my mind better than you know my mind. But if I say, someone believes that, then people will ask me, how do you know that, right? People will not ask me, if I say, I believe something, how do you know that you believe that? Nobody will ask this question, right? Because of course you believe that. So Donald Davidson is trying to provide an explanation why there is such kind of asymmetry. When I say, I believe something, you will not ask me, say, why do you believe, how do you know you believe that? But when I say, someone else believes something, you will ask this question. Now, I will skip a lot of his discussion. Just come to his conclusion, Donald Davidson's conclusion. He says, the best way to appreciate this difference, the difference between I say, I believe, I know what I believe, and I say, I know what other people believe, this difference. The best way to appreciate this difference is by imagining a situation in which two people who speak unrelated languages and are ignorant of each other's languages are left alone to learn, to communicate. Let one of the imagined pair speak and the other try to understand. It is obvious that the interpreter has nothing to go on but the pattern of sound the speaker exhibits in conjunction with the further events. It makes no sense in this situation to wonder whether the speaker is generally getting things right, because you have to assume that there is a presumption, an unavoidable presumption built into the nature of interpretation, that the speaker usually knows what he means. So there is a presumption that if he knows that he holds a sentence true, he knows what he believes. What I'm trying to say is that in such a case, when we say we understand others, what is the criteria of saying that? That means we understand others as they understand themselves. If I say, this is what you are understanding, that is what you believe, but if the person says, no, that's not what I believe, then I must be wrong. I cannot say, you must be wrong, because here there is a first-person authority. Now, the second question. The first question is, we can say we understand other only if we understand other as others understand themselves. So the second question is it possible for us to understand other as they understand themselves? Okay, because I have to skip a lot of things. Now, here we come to this kind of difficult issue. As you can all know, the hermeneutic philosopher, most famous one, Hans Gadamer, in his view, understanding essentially is the fusion of the interpreter's horizon and that of the other being interpreted. When he makes this claim, he emphasizes that he is not merely making a normative claim that we should or ought to understand the other in such a way. Rather, he claims that he is making an objective observation of what is actually involved in our activities of understanding. Now, according to this view, we can never understand the other as they understand themselves. But I think there is a difference. The hermeneutic that Gadamer has in mind is primarily interested in understanding classics and or their authors who are normally not the interpreter's contemporaries. Neither classics nor their ancient authors can help us confirm whether our understanding of them is correct or not. However, we are concerned only with understanding of the people who are potential recipients of our action. Thus, we can always check with them whether our understanding of them is correct or not, whether what we understand as their ideas and ideals, preferences and desires, likes and dislikes, etc., are indeed what they consider to be theirs. In this sense, it's interesting to mention something by one of my former teachers, Harvard comparative philosopher, or comparative theologian, Wilfred Cantwell Smith. And in his discussion, he says in objective knowledge, he means like scientific knowledge, that a first observer's understanding has done justice to what is observed is testable by the experience of a second and a third observer. In corporate critical self-consciousness, what he means by corporate critical self-consciousness is in human science, in the study of human beings, that justice has been done to the matter being studied is testable by experience of other observers, but also by that of the subject or subjects. In other words, if we want to study a tree, we cannot ask a tree, is our understanding of you correct or not? But when we try to understand a human being, we can always ask them whether my understanding of you, say, this is my understanding of your ideas. Is this correct? And this person can tell me, oh, yeah, this is correct, or that's wrong. If the second case, we need to make our further efforts. I don't know, perhaps I should stop it here, right? Okay. 1 minute, okay. So, to completely understand the other, whether as an individual person or as a community, is indeed a difficult, if not impossible task. However, first, this cannot become our excuse for not making efforts to understand the other. As we have tried to argue, without an appropriate understanding of the other, we cannot assure ourselves that our action toward affecting other are appropriate ones. Second, while perhaps we can never fully understand the other, as long as we keep trying our best, we can have an increasingly better understanding of the other, and thus making our action affecting the other increasingly more appropriate. Third, it's true that we often have to act before we fully understand the other, yet such actions themselves should be regarded at the same time as a way for us to understand the other better. If we find that our actions toward the other have caused unexpected harm to the other, we can correct or improve our understanding of the other so that our future actions affecting the other will become more appropriate. Finally, the importance of efforts to understand the other lies not only in its actual result, our understanding of the other, but also in our very effort to understand the other. Our efforts to understand the other can indeed make our actions toward the other morally more appropriate, but such efforts themselves also express our respect for the unique ideas and ideals, customs and religions, desires and preferences of others. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are running a bit late, a few minutes, but I think we should take 5 more minutes to give Wha-Chul Son from Handong Global University enough time to give his presentation on the question, do we play God? The problem of we in a technological society. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome to Korea. I'm Wha-Chul Son from Handong University. It's from Pohang in Korea. When I got the schedule, I was very happy because I was the last presenter of the first session, which means I come to morning, do my presentation, and I'm done. Also, I expected this. It was very evident that I will not have enough time. So whatever is nonsense I speak, there would be no matter. As far as I finish early, then everybody will be very happy. So it's good. So I prepared from conclusion. So Professor Baumann, whenever you like, you can stop me because I've done with my conclusion. In order to pursue the desirable future for human beings, it is necessary to democratize the current form of technological progress. It is important whether we, the people, will have some say in the process of decision-making process concerning how, when, and why to develop and use which technology. We will experience a better future only if we become more realistic concerning who we are in the contemporary technological society. This is where humanities meet the cutting-edge technologies of our era in a most concrete, practical, and urgent manner. If we fail to engage in this effort, the human future will be something that has nothing to do with our desire. It would not be a problem, of course, because by then we will be something else. So I will start with myth. the myth that I define is ungrounded, irrational force, but widely spread idea. Myth is not only misleading, but has formative power. It does not only distort the reality, but also construct it. Now, human being has this curious tendency to create myth, and most recent myth that human beings have created is myth of technology. There are two mythical ideas on technology that I would like to deal with. First is the idea that the idea of we the human stays firm in the discourse on technology in our time. We the human is commonly considered to be the subject and master of technological innovations and their outcomes. In response, Jacques Ellul's argument of autonomous technology questions whether human beings are really in control of technological development. According to him, human beings as individuals or as a group do not have choice in technological decision-making procedure. Now, this negative approach is often connected with the ideas such as playing God. Mainly regarding bioengineering, many raises the question whether it is not playing God to manipulate human. Now, the playing God critique seems to be always taken together with this autonomous technology idea, but this idea, this critique, still stands in the line of we the human idea. As far as one seeks a way out from the current situation, one is not denying the human control over technology. But there is much simpler counter-argument against we the human discourse. Namely, it is not we, the human, who develop and use new technologies, but some people. Only few people have access to various technologies, and even fewer to the decision-making process. The belief that we, the human, has developed such and such technology is just a metaphorical expression rather than a description of the real. We don't play God. Some do. The second element of myth of technology is somewhat contradictory to the first. Namely, technology will progress whether we want or not. Here, the we appears again, but in a very humble manner. Technological progress is considered as something like a weather change, as one does not try to alter tomorrow's weather, but to prepare oneself. People take the progress of technology and its direction for granted. In consequence, future technologies and their social influences are forecasted, and people are advised to prepare or adjust to the coming future. The possibility of designing the future is not an option. So I call this technology forecast. In my opinion, however, the inevitability of technological progress is a typical myth that constructs our reality. It is a self-enforcing myth which becomes true and real by believing in it. The myth itself is nullifying the fact that there is always humans who create technology. It is ironical that technology, the human enterprise to overcome the natural power, is being considered to be another kind of natural force. The myth of technology expands even further as the technological progress in our time is taking a new path. We call this in different names, the fourth industrial revolution, or artificial AI, and artificial intelligence era, or the era of postmodern. As a matter of fact, posthumanism does not directly oppose the myth of technology in terms of human mastery over technological development. It seems to be meaningless issue to them because the distinction between human and non-human has been blurred. This has to do with the fact that posthumanists take a different path concerning the first element of myth. Namely, by raising questions about the very nature of human beings, the posthumanist theorists introduce variations into the issue of the we, the human. They take the possibility of radical change of human nature seriously. At the same time, new beings will come into the boundary of human beings. The discourses on post-human reveals us the extreme possibility of the future technology, and thus the challenge posed by the common myth of technology. The prospect of near future reveals the fact that there are only two options: either to give up the human mastery over technology and to accept the inevitability of technological progress, or to claim the human mastery over technology and to deny the inevitability of technological progress. Now, you see, but at this moment, we seem to accept the red lines. On the one hand, we accept the mastery over technology. On the other hand, we assume that technological development is inevitable. However, if we choose between the two, the choice seems to be apparent. The first option is contradictory in the sense that it only permits us to live along the tide of our time. The questions and reflection of our time and technology, as this paper attempts to do, presuppose the possibility of human mastery over technology, even if it is not full mastery. Even if the new definition of human nature is the outcome of technological progress in the future, the progress itself is still at the hands of present human beings. Human beings are supposed to choose whether to pursue the progress, and if they want, which direction it should take. One of the valuable insights that post-human theories provided is that new development in technology force us to rethink about human nature. AI make us to think about the nature of human intelligence. Even the distinction between human and non-human becomes blurred, according to humanist theorists. So I skipped too many sentences, that's why, sorry. Therefore, it is crucial to raise the question concerning who and what we, the human, really is, and on what the desirable state of human being is. If one acknowledges the fact that human beings and the context of their lives are influenced by technology to the core, the philosophical reflection on the ideal condition of human beings is necessary. The fast development of technology requires more research and contemplation in humanities. Instead of trying to get ready for the coming change, we should be determined to direct the change. Human beings cannot be defined only as a subject of technological development. We, the human, is not self-parent anymore in this era and requires discussions that will lead to a consensus. How could we still keep the mastery over technological development in the real sense? Where should be the topos of human beings in technological society? How could we free ourselves from the dominant myth of our time? First, we need to use more concrete language in describing and analyzing our technological society. Technologies do not develop in a vacuum. Often we think as if technological progress is a pure and neutral process independent of any context. We all know, however, this is not true. Technological development is entangled with concrete market system, political concerns, and many other factors. Therefore, it is important to address the real subject or agent of technological progress and the actual power relationship among the relevant parties. This is becoming ever more significant in our contemporary high-tech society as fewer and fewer dominates the progress. Apart from analyzing the reality and pondering upon the desirable status of human beings, one needs to get away from the mythical form of the we, the people, and transform it into a state in which we, the people, have real control over technology. If technology is rescued from those who few dominates it, then the human mastery over technology would become more certain and the notion of autonomous technology would be refuted accordingly. Democratization of technology does not need to be the whole change in our economic or political system related to technology. The first step would be the recognition that technology changes the context and nature of our life, world, and eventually ourselves. The next step would be to vision a picture of a good society. What is the features of society that I wish to live? What kind of human being I want to be? As a matter of fact, this question have been asked throughout years in political realm and in philosophy, but now we need to ask the same question concerning technology. Now I spent 13 minutes, and as conclusion you have seen already. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So since we are already over time, I suggest that we, and don't have time for discussion, that we give a heartfelt thanks to our keynote speaker and to all the speakers for the plenary session. Thank you very much.